Does coffee. Good morning.
Well, good morning to everyone. Welcome to History Matters, and I will truly confess, History Matters, and so does Fresca. I didn't have time to make coffee, so I'm drinking Fresca. As advertised, we will be talking about nostalgia, and what I ended up branding the trap of nostalgia. I will explain what I mean in a moment. However, before I begin speaking about the topic at hand, I will turn to my partner in crime, who currently does not exist. Oh, there she is, she's back, who will explain the rules of the game.
Thank you all so much for being with us here today. This is the 101st episode of History Matters, and so does coffee. We had a wonderful time last week. It was wonderful to hear from all of you, to know how much Joanne means in your life. So thank you for coming back again today. We're thrilled you're here. Do participate in the chat, and if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. And of course, we are having a very exciting event next week at our conference. Our conference is March 17th through 20th. We encourage you to sign up. We've got incredible speakers like Peniel Joseph, like Alexis Coe, like LeGarrette King. Please make sure you come. But very importantly, on Thursday night, our evening event that is open to the public is History Matters, and So Do Cocktails with Joanne Freeman. And we will be celebrating 100 episodes that she has done. And you will see those links on Facebook and Twitter. If you go to ncheteach.org/conversations, that link is up there, but you'll sign in just like you did today. So with that exciting announcement, I am going to pass things over to Joanne, who is going to warn us about the dangers of nostalgia.
While you try and figure out how to get us on Facebook. Okay. Hello to everyone. And good morning, indeed. As always, I do, as I mentioned last week, the problem with 100 episodes is that then I have to worry, like, have I spoken about this before? Haven't I? Why haven't I? If I did I do it the same way? And I have not spoken about nostalgia before. I don't actually know how I found my way here. I can't recreate that because it was last night after I recorded my podcast. Someone just got bingo, I know. But see, this is what you've done to me with this bingo game. But it occurred to me for a variety of reasons, partly because in so many ways in the current American political climate, and this is not newly true now, but it has been true certainly for a number of years, nostalgia has been promoted politically big time. Again, that's not a new phenomenon, but the idea, just the again, not at the end of, Make America Great Again. The again it is kind of a nostalgic glance, right? And it's very vague, general, and open, which is a very useful thing for nostalgia to be, because it refers to some golden, wonderful, happy time in the past. We don't have to be specific about it, but it's some time that people can point to and say, that was the time, that was the golden time, that was the great time. That's kind of the idea that I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the idea that certainly nostalgia is not new. The politicization of nostalgia isn't new, and the kinds of values and needs that people impose into nostalgia also are not new, particularly politically speaking. But I want to start out by making a point about nostalgia. And I know in a variety of different ways, week to week, I talk about, and I say this every time I talk about it, my apologies, I talk about emotion in one way or another, emotion and politics. Nostalgia is interesting because in some ways you can say it's an emotion of remembrance, right? It's the sort of emotion you have at remembering something from the past or your past, and it has emotion associated with it. And often it's a positive sort of sensation or a longing, perhaps, but there's something sweet, bittersweet, perhaps, but sweet about our general idea about nostalgia. But I think also if you're being nostalgic, like really aggressively being nostalgic for something that has passed, that could also be a way of trying to maintain or regain control. If you don't like where things are, you can be nostalgic for another time in the past that is more closely aligned with how you would like things to be. Now, that's really not a new phenomenon, right? You can, I remember at one point writing about a New Hampshire politician who was trying to understand the beginnings of American government. And I was reading his diaries and journals as he was trying to figure out where do ideas about American government come from. And this was in the early, like 1802, 1803, 1804, early 19th century. And in his diary, he begins to back up and back up and back up to try and find the start of what he considers to be American government. And he gets all the way back to hieroglyphics somehow. And it's been many, many years since I looked at this, so I cannot recreate for you how he does that, but he does it, right? He keeps backing up, looking, well, no, but then there was this. This really helped. Well, then this helped create it. Somehow, hieroglyphics. That's not quite what I'm talking about today, but the impulse there in which he's standing in the present and reaching back to the past to sort of understand, you know, how not in a historical sense per se necessarily only, but like, where can I find the real origin of this? What are the roots? What can I touch? What's the home base of what I'm looking at now? Nostalgia is complicated. It's emotional. It can be about understanding history, but as I just said a moment ago, it can also very much be about control. It's an emotion linked to wanting to maintain or regain control. And it's a way of reasserting a sense of control by focusing on things that, to the person being nostalgic, things that seemingly made one feel grounded or felt good about the past or seemed steady and solid. And yeah, like those were the days when, and you could fill in the blank, and one person's nostalgia will be another person's repression. We will come back to that idea shortly. But still, the idea there is you can look back to a moment when you can feel as though things were going the way you would like them to be now. And there they were in control and wonderful. And I will longingly point to that and gesture towards that and claim that I want that to come back, because look at those wonderful, glorious times. Now, that idea of nostalgia is linked to the idea of the Jeremiad, right? And that's something that the Puritan New Englanders were really good at, the Jeremiad. And Jeremiad meaning, we have fallen so far from the golden past, linked to the idea that for the Puritans, like we are a chosen people, and we are here in New England as a chosen people to really lead the way, to be a city on a hill, all of the sort of phrasing and terminology that the Puritans used in thinking about themselves and their role in the world. The Jeremiad, which they were wonderful at, was, we are here and we're supposed to be the city on the hill and the chosen people, but we have already fallen, right? We are in a state of free fall. Things are bad. Things have been better. Why are we not living up to what we can be, right? That's related to an idea of nostalgia. You can see, if you look at throughout history, certainly everywhere, but I'm going to focus on the United States right now, other people sort of playing at that, looking to some moment in the past, and very often, as with the again in Make America Great Again, a hazy moment in the past, even a non-existent moment in the past, which I'm going to come back to that as well. For example, Thomas Jefferson, a number of times in his writings, he points to this wonderful Anglo-Saxon past moment when there were true, he would not necessarily use the word British, but the real values of America's British past. This hazy Anglo-Saxon past, he likes, you know, an alleged poet from that time period who supposedly didn't really exist, but he liked him anyway. Jefferson creates this past of the values that he values, that enables him to sort of leap over the current British Empire and go to a different one in the past that represented in some way or another, not an empire, but certainly values that he values and that enable him to create a kind of past that make him feel comfortable in his present and to hide away from aspects of the present that he really doesn't want to associate with and doesn't want to deal with. So nostalgia is a way of sometimes trying to get control or feel that you're getting control. It can also be a way of making yourself feel comfortable, and it can be a kind of amnesia, a kind of erasure, right? A kind of historical amnesia, a kind of erasure of stuff, things that you don't like now, and you look to the past at a moment when things were much better, and it allows you to either ignore what you don't like now or act as though whatever's happening now is really not here and shouldn't count, and rather you'll just look back to this other time that you think was better, and that of course will be reasserted in the future, because if you're truly being nostalgic, some part of you is pining for and probably wishing for some state like that to exist again. Now, when I thought about this first last night, trying to think of how I was going to discuss this, what came to mind for me, and some of you may have heard of these books, some of you may not, but they're a prime example of this. There were a series of books written for the most part in the 1850s, so the lead up to the Civil War, which is key here. And these books, in one way or another, were looking back to this wonderful golden past of the founding, right? And the particular books I'm going to mention here were not only looking back to the golden, wonderful founding, in many ways, they were looking back to women in the golden founding era. One of them is by Rufus Griswold, which is a wonderful 19th century name, called The Republican Court, or American Society in the Days of Washington. Another one by Elizabeth Elliot is titled The Court Circles of the Republic. And a third by Anne Hollingsworth Wharton, Salons, Colonial and Republican. What all of these books did around the time of the Civil War, one, I think Wharton might be a little bit after, but in one way or another, what they do is they look back to this earlier period, they portray it as this golden age of civility and manners and politeness and unity and union creating. And the courts in particular, the Republican court or the court circles or the salons, for all of these authors, first of all, they are spaces where women are included, and women are acting as people who are doing some of the uniting and constructing of positive spaces, of creating union, of bringing people together. So in one way or another, all of these books are being very nostalgic for this time that certainly in some ways never quite existed the way that they exist in these books, right? That the period that they're pointing to is this wonderful civil moment of union. We've talked about this now over the course of 101 episodes. Not all that genteel, right? I mean, we talk about a lot of the angst. I write a lot and work a lot about the 1790s, like this period of extreme anxiety and violence in the streets, and a lot of things that these books in the mid-19th century are not pointing to, but they very much, in the lead up to the Civil War, at a moment when things are divided and Americans are turning against each other, they create and highlight and put a real sort of glossy haze over this wonderful moment in the past that wasn't like the present, suggesting, right, that that's golden and wonderful, and we have been that before. It's a little Jeremiah-esque sort of tone here too. That's really what we are, right? That's truly what we are. Now, the interesting angle here, as I said, it's the angle about women, is that in the case of at least some of these books, it's a woman writing them, and they're pointing to these salons or court spaces where women really, in a way, held court. Women had some degree of cultural power. So it's interesting that at this moment, the 1850s, when things are looking very dire and very grim, and Americans are turning against each other, that in addition to having this nostalgic look back at the founding era, you do have some women that are saying, yeah, we're going to be nostalgic about the founding, and look at how women were really pulling things, holding things together. Like, by the way, we're going to point that out too. It's a politicized and powerful form of nostalgia, and in this case, certainly for political, I suppose you could say, and cultural purpose. But still, showing you that nostalgia, on the one hand, is an emotion, is something that we all feel in one way or another about something at any given time, but that it can be strategic and purpose-driven and have a political use. Now, obviously, at the current moment, we see this some version of nostalgia about the past playing out in one way or another a lot. And people don't necessarily use the word nostalgia. As a matter of fact, they don't, right? They claim that they're looking back to just a wonderful moment in the past, like a fine moment in the past when things were better. And I'm not even speaking specifically about any one kind of political person here. I am just saying that generally speaking right now, there is this sense, particularly people who are concerned that we are focused too much on things like race and gender, which are at the center of many of our public debates now for a very good reason. But if you don't want that to be happening right now, it is a fine thing for you if you feel that you can look to a past when that wasn't a big issue in the way that it is now. Now, of course, you may be creating that past, right? You may be saying, well, look, we weren't always so focused on this. In the old days, you know, people knew who they were as far as their gender is concerned, and we weren't so focused on race and racism in the way that we are now. One person's nostalgic, hazy, wonderful past is another person's repressive past. So nostalgia is highly subjective. So an interesting component of it when it's being used politically is that for some people, it's going to have the power and the pull that the person deploying it wants it to have. For other people, it very explicitly won't, and it's kind of a clear way of indicating who you are and are not including in your political circle, depending on the past that you're hearkening back to. So part of why I'm bringing this up and part of why I'm talking about this today and pointing out that it's certainly not new, but what's worth thinking about here, past and present, but particularly now, is that when people are being nostalgic for a past, sometimes it's for control, sometimes it's for erasure, sometimes it's for stasis, sometimes it's to push off change. You always need to think about the why and the what when people are being nostalgic in a politicized manner, right? And right now, given that, you know, I kind of don't love the phrase culture war because it kind of almost, well, I won't even go into that, but at any rate, we use the phrase culture war to refer to this moment when people are fighting using cultural topics and issues and subjects and words to fight a political battle. And it's precisely that kind of logic and that kind of dynamic that can erase what's really going on. And I suppose it's another way of my common theme that I talk about week to week, that when your emotions are being pulled into politics in one way or for another, we've talked about this regarding propaganda. Here we're just talking about if people are saying, oh, the good old days when things were so much better and we didn't really focus on gender and race in the same way we do now, these horrible people making us focus on race and gender. Oh no, that's again, deploying emotion, not as a way of revealing history or discussing history or debating history or whatever you want to do with history. It's a way of constructing a deliberately deployed and strategic history bound in by emotion, and for that reason, all the more powerful. That thinking about all of the ways in which people harken back to this wonderful, non-existent golden past, you need to always think about the fact that you shouldn't let the emotion of that erase the reality of that, erase the reality of what that past was, erase the reality of what it means to be reaching out in that direction or trying to create that kind of space, and erase the reality of what the desired outcome is by people hearkening back to a non-existent past. So nostalgia, it's fascinating to study because it's such a, it's deliberate and strategic, but in another way, there's also something kind of guttural about it, right? That it's like, this is what I want. So it's speaking as a historian who very much enjoys trying to climb into people's mind frame, their mindscape, and trying to understand how they're seeing things and what it is they're really wanting or not wanting or fighting for or fighting against in a way that isn't always absolutely at the front of their mind. Nostalgia is an interesting way to do that. And that's true, you know, that's even true when you think about things like fashion trends. Like, why does a certain fashion trend come back at a certain time? Sometimes that's linked with the nature of what that fashion makes your body do when you're wearing it. There are all kinds of ways that nostalgia and that kind of longing for the past reveals so much about the present. But I suppose I'm highlighting that this morning to point out the fact that there is a great political significance in that same impulse, and it can be easy to miss it. And it's all the more powerful and all the more dangerous because of that. Because nostalgia can be a goad or prod to get you to want something that never existed. But if you want it, it might push things in a direction that some particular people of a political persuasion want you to go. So think about nostalgia, as with so many other things, before you get swept up in the emotion of it when it's on political terrain in some way, or when it's being used by people as an argument, as opposed to an observation. I am nostalgic for X, as Joanne Freeman. Think about what it means and what it's doing and who it's erasing, right? Who it is saying, no, doesn't, what they have or want or were at that time doesn't matter. So for example, when people will say to me, like, wouldn't you love to go back to the founding era? Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't you love to go back there? And I always think to myself, well, okay, yes, I'm white. So if I were not white, that would, on a whole bunch of levels, would be horrible. But let's go beyond that. As a woman, I probably would have died in childbirth because I'm small. As a Jew, I would have just a whole bunch of other problems thrown in. So, you know, do I want to go back to the founding era? Well, not any founding era that really existed. You know, would I love to know what people were saying or thinking? Yeah, if I could be invisible and not exist. But if you're longing for another time period, you have to think about who you're longing for and what they really would have been, and what that suggests about who's in, as I always say, who's in the we, the us. Who are you thinking about, who you're not thinking about, and what does that have to do with power and erasure and the reconstruction of history and a deliberate push towards a very specific future of a sort that you may want and that others might not. That's the main point that I wanted to reach for today. I think I'm going to stop there because it's a very broad topic, and I want to really open things up for questions. I have no idea where this will take us. It's a not as sort of grounded in history topic that I normally take. So I was a little nervous about doing it today, but I'm very curious to see where our conversation will take us. So I will pause. However, yes, I can see Carolee saying mug, mug, mug. So let me reveal the mug, which I received last week, but I had to use the 100 episode mug last week. This is actually, so we're having a Tom kind of morning. This is from Tom, and it actually was the perfect mug for today. History should make you feel uncomfortable. It should make you think. It should make you realize, right, thinking about the past, disjunctures and problems as well as accomplishments. It should not be golden and smooth and easy. If it's all golden and smooth and easy, it's not history, it's a fairy tale. So Tom, thank you very much. It is a wonderful mug, and by not using it last week, it is perfect for today. When I went into the kitchen to figure out like what mug, I was like, oh, I had washed it and had not even put it away yet. So that is today's mug. It is a Tom morning indeed.
And I just disappeared there for a second so that I could screenshot just you holding the mug, Joanne. Tom, I will send you it.
Okay. I no longer, I do not question. People vanish and reappear, and I just totally accept it. It's all good.
Yes, unfortunately, like you, Joanne, I am convinced this is all just black magic, and it's not going the best. So,
no.
Yes. Well,
and I did print out my notes, and I did get this fine page of notes and this. So whatever else I was going to talk about, it's somewhere else. I don't know where, but that's our morning on History Matters today.
Yes, indeed. And we will, for those of you who you'll be watching this later on Facebook, I will post this the very second we log off, Joanne. I'm having the most fascinating technological moment. I can't call out from my phone, which seems like it should be an unrelated issue. I don't know. I think I'm just in a different dimension. So forgive us all for that. It's fascinating, but
actually, we could even, maybe someone out there at NCHE could tweet out, we had a Facebook problem, and we will be posting this so that people know.
That sounds like an excellent plan. Thank you. Yes.
Good idea.
Do that, and we will post it immediately. But at least I could listen to soothing words about nostalgia while I panicked technologically and wished for the good old days when I didn't have to do this.
But the good old days when we could not have had History Matters.
Exactly. Yes. You're exactly right. So we do have lots of questions. This does. Oh, I think I already talked about my background, um,
You can give
but
us more detail on what
it's
it
just a hand painted photochrome. So I do always think that it's like almost literally the rose colored glasses, right? We're painting it in exactly as we would have liked it to be. So again, this is from the. This is, I believe, actually a photochrome of a stage show. So this is in fact
Oh,
literally people just acting out dinner.
wow.
Although that
Okay,
is
so
a
it really is a non-existent past.
it is, yes.
That's
And it
kind of
is
perfect, Grace.
it is. Although that does appear to be a real large and charming dog who is at that dinner. So but this of course, as with all these, would have been viewed through a stereopticon, so or a stereoscope. So it is something someone would have looked at and gone, ah, yes, remember how we used to have dinners in the good old days. So, it's something that people really love. All right. Oh, we've got some really good questions today.
Okay.
It's really hard to choose. Doesn't nostalgia depend on one's cultural background? So how does that impact our national nostalgia given our diverse populations?
Ooh, that is an excellent question. And it is totally true. And something that I crossed my mind and that I didn't actually write down has to do with nostalgia and national identity, which is bound up with this too, right? So yeah, nostalgia, I mean, in a sense, it can be very personal, right? It is very subjective and very personal and very political. But yeah, it entirely can depend on you personally, you culturally, your family, your history, your background. It's which is why it's particularly um, dangerous in a sense as a political tool. Because by definition, if you're being nostalgic about something, you're including some and excluding some. Universal nostalgia is a difficult thing to achieve, right? If you're thinking back to a past, most pasts that we're going to point to in American history before a certain point are going to be grounded on some really fundamental form of either slavery or Jim Crow, right? So if you're like, the past, I'm nostalgic for it, that exists in that past. So whatever you're being nostalgic for, if you're being nostalgic and not dealing with those things, that's what I mean when I say erasure. If you're saying, yes, the good old days when X was true, yeah, X was true. And Jim Crow institutionalized racism in a really extreme kind of a way, and we tried to make that go away, but it existed, right? That's the kind of erasure. I saw someone whiz by me here in chat saying, what do you mean? Who are you erasing? That's an example of erasure. Right? If you're looking back to a golden time and it's golden for some people and really not golden for others, what does it mean if you're looking back to that time? Who are you including and who are you excluding, and what does that mean?
We did see a couple interesting notes in the chat about different cultures and nostalgia that people in the audience here have experienced. So that's very, very
Oh,
interesting.
interesting. Okay, I
We have
can't
two
see it.
related questions here.
Yes.
So, and by the way, that was Dale's question that I just asked because
Oh,
someone pointed out
sorry.
I should acknowledge where the amazing questions come from. Anne and Tim have related questions. So Anne says, are there periods in American history when nostalgia is not prevalent? Is it inevitable as long as there is political discourse? And the related question is nostalgia, from Tim, is nostalgia more present, more operative during times of national stress as opposed to times of national calm? Is this always a conversation, or are we seeing dips and peaks in this?
Well, I would say, speaking as a historian without even necessarily getting specific, dips and peaks has to be the case. Nothing,
Of everything.
it does. Well, because nothing, I won't even say that. I always tell my students, do not say like never, always, unique. Those things are almost inevitably there's something wrong. But things don't tend to do this or this. They tend to do this throughout history. And I think that's, like when I speak with my students about the rights of women, and people want very much to believe that this is what happens. It's hard nowadays to think that, but for a time, people could believe that like this is what happens with the rights of women. It's like, well, yeah, but if you think about it, you had the revolution, you had a moment when women were beginning to feel that they had some political power. Then you had, as the wonderful Rosie Zagari has written in Revolutionary Backlash, the slam against that. Then you had a response against that. Then you had so that's really more than anything else how everything moves. It's a action and counteraction in one way or another is how we move through time. So I don't think there's a smooth cycle of how this works. I do think related to either one of the questions or part of the question, during times of crisis or during times of strife, yeah, nostalgia has a huge appeal because it's a way of moving out of that present. It's a way of telling yourself things can be better, things will be better, they have been better in the past. What we're seeing now is just some weird blip on the radar screen and things were better before. There are any number of ways in which nostalgia can be calming in the present. And it's an important question in part two, because I don't want to say here like nostalgia is always bad, because it isn't, right? I'm not actually saying that. And it makes perfect sense. I mean, even in a given moment, I could sit here and say, am I feeling nostalgic in any way? It's like, yeah, probably, among other things, for a period when I wasn't focused on politics every minute of every day, right? Like there was a point before, I don't know, I'm not even going to fill in the blank. You could fill in the blank for how many years this has been, but am I nostalgic for a period, a different point in my life when I was focused more on some things and less on, whatever horrible thing we're dealing with in the big list of horribles that we have to grapple with on a daily basis? Yeah, you could say that's a form of nostalgia. Does that mean that I am ignoring what's going on now? No, that's just a sort of personal, and I'm sure many of you out there feel that in one way or another. We're in a moment of crisis. How nice is it to think about a moment when we did not have this kind of immediate crisis? You could say that's kind of nostalgia. It's not going to do much, and I don't think it's useful to think, as I've said before, as I've said actually in the very first episode when I talked about contingency, I don't think it's useful to say like this is just this is going to pass, it's no big deal, because we don't know that, right? So I also don't think it's useful to say we're doomed and nothing is going to happen that's good and we're all going to hell in a handbasket. It's bad, 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 because we don't know that for sure either. And nostalgia can be a way of moving you in a direction that is kind of blinding you to the present. But I don't think nostalgia is necessarily bad. I just think it can be used either thoughtfully or thoughtlessly as a way to shape the past in a useful way for certain people and not for other people, to include people and exclude people in the we that you're talking about at a given moment, to suggest or shape or push national identity in one direction or another. I mean, nostalgia in that sense is not totally unrelated to bad history, right? To people who are making up histories making histories that never make you feel uncomfortable, right? People that are looking to histories that are comforting in some way for a very explicit purpose in the present. It's kind of part of the same impulse, I guess you could say. Gets back to, and this was actually a topic I thought I was going to talk about, and I thought I was going to talk about the importance of history, of studying history. I've talked about that in one way or another before, and decided I would not do that today, but I will do that in the near future because of some people yelling on Twitter about why it's important to study history. And of course, that gets me riled up every time. But it's not unrelated, right? Creating a golden, non-existent past in a nostalgic sense, and creating a non-existent past, or ignoring the uncomfortable aspects of the past for the purposes of the present, are related impulses, I guess, is part of what I would say.
Right. Thank you. We have one from Miranda here. Would it be fair to say that the lost cause narrative is, she calls it, is it the gold standard of myth and nostalgia? Is that sort of the height of what you've seen, or are there other moments that are as movements that are as intense as that?
Fraught, the word I like to use. That feels as though it's a gold standard, doesn't it? Or the gold standard that truly ignores, creates, erases, reconstructs in not a positive way a past for explicitly political and identity purposes, initially for one group of people, now, in another time, in another period, with another, it's not, nowadays, it's not just Confederates, it's people using the Confederacy for whatever purpose they want. It's true that in a way feels like, I'm trying to think of something that surpasses the lost cause narrative. Does anyone out there, it'd be actually a great way to
It's a
start
good
opening up.
discussion question. Yeah.
Is there another thing that we can, another moment that we could put on a par with the lost cause narrative as a kind of nostalgic past?
Carrie suggests Holocaust denial.
Holocaust denial. I guess that's true, although that's less nostalgia than just pure erasure, right? Because the lost cause has a nostalgia component. The noble, wonderful Confederates, fighting for their cause, and gallant and cavaliers and all that hoo-ha about that's bound up with it. Holocaust denial is just denial, although founders nostalgia, that actually is one that I was looking at this morning when I was trying to decide what to talk about. Creating this, lofty group of founding fathers, which you have to say in that tone of voice, who only do good things and never do any bad things, and lived up to everything that they said. We've had this conversation before on History Matters, right? That there were no perfect ideal standing on a pedestal founding fathers. There just weren't, and people want them to exist. And by wanting them to exist and creating them to serve that purpose, they are erasing the actual struggle and reality and process that led to the creation of the country. And what's striking about that, because I know there are people who are like, well, as a matter of fact, I just was arguing with one of them on Twitter. We need heroes. We need heroes. Why can't we have heroes? It's like, well, yeah, but people can be heroic for any number of things. Hero doesn't mean, I am always noble and lofty and I am a hero, right? There are different reasons to praise someone for being a hero. And the founders themselves did not want to be treated like golden, lofty figures of myth at all. And I've quoted John Adams any number of times here. He's the guy who always pricks every balloon of pomp and circumstance, John Adams, when it comes to, willingness to be self-deprecating and to point out the ugly realities. He's the guy who says over and over and over and over and over again, we didn't know what we were doing. Like, people in his old age, people write to him all the time, right? And they're like, tell us about the golden age, like you and the Declaration and the lofty wonderfulness of this. And he says over and over again in a series of letters, look, I watched people sign the Declaration. There were a lot of people who were not happy about signing that document, but they did it. But they weren't happy, right? We didn't know what we were doing. We made mistakes. There's one letter I know I've quoted before in which he says, we made mistakes. We made mistakes in 1775, 76, 77, 78. He just marches his way through. He's like, we didn't know what we were doing. We were not being perfect. We didn't even like some of the good things that we did. We were clueless, but we tried, but we were clueless, and we were not all on the same page. And a lot of people were not thrilled with the things you are now trying to give them credit for having done. So, Adams, granted, is not every person who we now brand, founder, would agree with that, but a lot of them would. James Madison sort of had the same idea when people would be like, tell us creation of the Constitution. And Madison would be very upfront about saying, let's talk about actual realities. There were some really good things that happened then, but I'm not gonna play that game. You can't do that with us. That's taking out the contention and the struggle and as I said before, the actual process of trying to make something, which is what democracy is based on, right? The founders would not have been cheering for democracy in the way we understand it now, so I can't draw that kind of a direct line, but they certainly would have said, it's the process, it's the conflict and the conversation and the debate and the compromise. That's how a democratic form of government works. And if you create some kind of golden past, or if you take those founders and even in their lifetime try to put them into some golden past, you're eliminating the actual reality of politics and creating a nation. It's literally erasing reality in a way that's going to do no one any good. It's going to erase the roots and essence and core and dynamic of how a nation functions, for better and worse. And if you eliminate the worse, you're kind of lost in the present. We, as so many of us here, history-minded people, could talk in this vein for a very long time, but you get my meaning, which is, but I love the fact, bringing up, I don't remember now who brought up the founders, but the fact that the founding generation of people were not thrilled with this whole idea of this nostalgic look at what they themselves were doing. That's pretty significant. That's pretty significant.
Well, I've seen this. I think this is happening in chat as well as in the questions. But there is a question here. This says, do you feel there have been? But I'm going to say, who do you feel have been historians in the past and even in the present that have pushed a historical nostalgic narrative?
Oh boy. Okay, I'm not going to name specific names because I'm not. What
You
I
can go
will,
far back in time to people who are no longer with us if you would prefer.
well, let me put it this way. It's going to be general, but what I will say, I'm not actually saying these are bad books, but they are books that do a very specific thing, right? If you think about some of the books, some of the big biographies of people, not all of them, not even the majority of them, but some of them, big biographies of people, sometimes written by historians, sometimes not, but that get very focused on a person and the greatness of a person out of context of time and place, right? So they become like, I shall write about Roger Sherman, the great Roger. I actually like Roger Sherman, but regardless, Roger Sherman, what a guy! Roger Sherman, he did these great things, and he was a wonderful person. And let's praise all the doings of Roger Sherman. And there's validity to that, but when you take him out of his time and place, you end up praising him or anyone for things that on the one hand might have been very typical of that time and place and aren't particularly heroic or wonderful. Very often, and as a historian, this is what I see, is a biography written by someone who doesn't have a sense of context, historical context, will be like, George Washington did this thing. What a guy! And I'm using him again, not referring to a specific book, but he's easy. He's George. What a guy! He did the specific thing. And as a historian, I might read that book and say, yeah, everyone did that thing. Because that's what you did at the time, right? Or praising someone for doing something or not doing something and not being aware of the fact that everyone did it that way, or you weren't supposed to do it that way. That historical context and the moment that someone lives in is a huge part of the meaning of what they do. And that's another thing that nostalgic ways of looking at the past or looking at people removes that component entirely, removes the actual historical context. And by that, I mean the actual ground level reality of what existed, right? You can, I mean, not given that I'm always in the world of Hamilton, I could say, with Hamilton, you could say, wow, Hamilton's father didn't go to his wedding. What a guy. Like, what does that say? What kind of father was Hamilton's father? He didn't go to his wedding. As a historian, I would say, well, see, the world was at war and his father couldn't hop on a Delta jet. So we can't point at that and draw conclusions about that. Nostalgia kind of fits into that same pool of messiness that you tend to want to make blame and purpose out of things that to me, all the interesting stuff, right? The historical context that explains why people are or aren't doing things that aren't immediately apparent, but would have made perfect sense at the time. So nostalgia also can be so present-minded that it just erases the pastness of the past.
Thank you. And I do want to acknowledge all of you who put Parson Weems in the chat at the same time.
Ah, yes. Okay. That's a safe one to go back to.
That's safe. No one's going to be upset if you
No one's going to be upset. So thank you. That is a perfect example.
And that is, of course, a very early biographer of George Washington, and where your cherry tree myths come from. So, yes, thank you all. You're well informed. I don't know if there are other examples of this you can point to, but I do think it's an interesting question and something to think about. Thinking of Norman Rockwell's regret over his early artwork, like what I was going to put behind my head,
Oh, interesting.
that helped shape nostalgia for America that rarely existed. He later changed his artistic approach. Do we know, again, we can move on from this question, but are there other people who may have used nostalgia as a tool and then maybe had some realization or regretted it?
Interesting. I mean, my answer wants to be yes, but then I have to come up with.
Yeah, right. I didn't think you'd have one on the tip of your
Right,
tongue,
off
but
the top of
I
my
do
head.
want to put that out there for people to think about
Yeah.
that. And of course, there are people like Sinclair Lewis wrote Main Street. That's kind of like trying to poke holes in this, in the nostalgia fuzziness that we all get lost in. So I think there are these characters who may take actions like that, and it's something for us all to think about this week and look for.
But there's also a sort of reversal of that I'll mention, and that is, and I've always found this fascinating, that the whole founder folk, when they began thinking about creating, having portraits made of themselves or statues, sculpture, they were very focused on the fact that they should not be bigger than life size. And I mean, down to the inch. So there are these
Yeah.
letters, comical letters to us, in which, like someone like John Adams would be like, well, no, my arm is this long. Like, if you're going to paint me, like, this is how many inches, and they were, it again, like so many things from another time and place, seems really comical, but the impulse behind it was, we're not bigger than life. Like, don't make us bigger than life, because that's monarchical, right? That's the old world. That's not the new world. They were very focused on wanting to, at least visually, seem what they were size-wise, not to make them seem like big, huge, overpowering individuals, which is interesting. It's its own way of fighting some kind of superhero, old world, monarchical figure. They were very explicitly trying to fight something they knew, which is what the old world in their mind did with leaders and rulers, and they were trying to have that not happen in the United States. But it's the same kind of impulse, and
Well,
just fascinating that they were focused on it to that degree.
and it seems like these impulses can probably go together. Like there are moments where there is intense nostalgia while also being modernization efforts of all sorts and an emphasis on science and
Right.
that they're often reactions to each other. Like my grandmother's house would have like Victorian antiques and chrome. And
Right.
sometimes
Right.
you can have these moments where both things are happening. So
Well,
that's
right,
interesting.
and which is, it goes back to that nostalgia isn't always bad, right?
Yeah.
Some nostalgia can just be, I am saving, a thing of my past that says something about my past. Like, let's see if you can see them back here. I don't know if you can. Do you see behind me those candlesticks, the gold-looking candelabra?
Yep.
Okay, so those were brought, my great grandmother took them with her when she fled Russia. She took those, their Sabbath candle holders,
Yeah.
um,
Wow.
which I keep there, in a sense, that's my family history, but that also, there's some nostalgic component to it, right? That it's like, that's my family and they fled and took what they could with them. And I like the strength of that. And so I keep that there. So that's a way in which a kind of nostalgia, but
Yeah.
it's a personal one. But it's bound up with, family and generations and strength and whatever else. Yeah, so I don't want to say nostalgia is always bad, but I do want to say, which is whatever the title is that I came up with for this episode, it can be a trap, because it can be a way of
Yeah.
including and excluding and shaping, and it can be a political tool in a destructive sense, that I think it's easy to overlook.
Absolutely.
Oh, there, someone, Tim, why I paint the way I paint. People are trying to find the Norman Rockwell
Oh,
reference.
good.
Yeah,
Yes.
because these
He's
are
a
wonderful History Matters people, and this is what they do. They find immediately online all of the wonderful stuff. But yeah, fashion fads. Well, fashion fads are nostalgic and fun, except if you're the person who is like watching people now. Like, what did I just see online? It was some 80s fashion fad. And I was like, yeah, that really wasn't good the first time around. Like, why are we bringing it back? But yeah, it can be fun. But as I kind of referenced before, there are some fashion fads that come back, and in part it has to do with what they represent. Like some
Hmm.
ways, there are some forms of clothing. What they do to you when you wear them actually has a lot to do with why they're popular. So, for example, I remember a long time ago at the Smithsonian going through an exhibit about clothing, and there was men wore the jacket that a lot of men wore in the late 18th century was constructed in such a way that it made them hold their shoulders in a certain way that you can see, like, it's not like we tend to want shoulders up, and it sort of pushed them down. And I hadn't realized before that, of course, clothing
Oh,
construction
yeah.
is very true in women's clothing in any number of
Hmm.
ways, but men's clothing as well, right? That clothing does a certain thing to you. You know, heels do certain things to your legs and how fast you can walk or run as a woman, and that's part of wearing them. You know, harkens back to those kinds of moments too. So there's, in that case, I suppose I would say, and I didn't say this before, there's conscious nostalgia and there's kind of unconscious things that you're hearkening and pulling at when you're being nostalgic, and both of them are important, I would say.
Yeah. And actually, just for a moment, because we're getting sort of close to the end, and I feel like we could do an entire show on this, but you have talked before about how we can look at historical documents and figure out where the truth lies or how much we can trust what's being written there. And there's certain things you look for,
Yeah.
like where a letter is sent from and the salutation. A lot of us are big fans of history. We go to museums, we read history, and we might look at a book and say, this is a credible historian. Are there red flags to help us that might make us go, I think we might be drifting into a little bit of nostalgia here. I think this may be, and this can be in the press too. What are those things we should look for that we might be inclined to just skim by unconsciously, but that we need to stop and say, I think someone's using nostalgia here in a way that's manipulating me?
Wow, that's a good question, which I would want a little longer to think about, but I can offer
Yeah.
one easy one, because I teach this all the time. It's not just true of nostalgia, but it is true of reading something that's talking in some way or another about the past or about history. Um, and I always see it as a red flag. And that is when you're reading something and it says something along the lines of, um, we will never understand why so and so did this because it appears to have been totally irrational, or so and so must
Mm.
have had him. But this is the case. There's long ago works about Hamilton where they would look at like some of the things he did that seemed pretty ridiculously ill thought out, and they'll be like, well, he might have had a temporary moment of maybe not insanity, but like he wasn't thinking straight. Like there's no way that made sense to him. And so we will never understand. If you get a we will never understand, or it was due to temporary insanity, screaming red flag. What that's saying is that person doesn't understand why this happened. And it is entirely possible something happened for no logical reason and that somebody was just being foolish or thoughtless. However, it's also entirely possible that there is a reason there, and maybe it's complicated or ugly or who knows. But to me, that's a screaming red flag that says something here is not being dealt with in an above the board kind of a way. If you're claiming there's no way to understand it and it must be temporary insanity, that suggests that something happened that was like bad or negative or did not work well. And rather than wrestling with that, you're just saying there can be no explanation. Bad things have explanations, mistakes have explanations. So that's one way. It's a very specific answer. But yeah, I do think, I think that's a very worthwhile question to ask, which is what when you're looking at something, how can you, are there ways in which the person writing it is explicitly trying not to deal with something or avoiding something? And I just think any historian that says we can never know, maybe and in some cases, sure, that's true, but very often there's more to be dug for. Hamilton is what got me into that mindset, because so many people would say that about the Reynolds pamphlet or his attack on John Adams when Adams is his own party's candidate for president and he writes a pamphlet attacking him. People tend to look at those things and say, you know, like the Adams pamphlet, why in the world would he do that? We can never fully understand. Like, and part of what I was saying in my first book was, well, yeah, actually, there are any number of ways to explain it. One way has to do with honor culture and dueling, which actually makes it make perfect sense. But yeah, if you don't know that, then it's just a stupid thing. You know?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one way to think.
Fascinating. Thank you. So keep an eye out for how the person is aware of context or avoiding
How
context.
they're
That's
avoiding
important. Thank you. Yeah.
avoidance. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's people saying we don't know or we can never know or why would this person do this thing? Oh, now look at this. Someone is pointing to Michael Adams' past and prologue, which of course my student, my former student, I had to point out, that he does thinking along those lines very wonderfully. Yes, he was my. I am very proud of all my grad students, my former grad students, and Michael is one. But I see we are over time. So, okay. So let me do what I must do as we come to our ending point here. At this moment, we will very soon segue into the after party. And what that means is that we will no longer be recording this episode so that we can have a slightly more free and easy conversation. If you have beamed in here through the NCHE website, just stay right where you are. And yes, someone's going to get bingo. Poof! You will automatically be in the after party. We can't talk to Facebook people because we never got Facebook on here. But normally I would say if you're on Facebook, you have to come in through the NCHE website, which I will say anyway, ncheteach.org/conversations. I will also say someone just got bingo. I saw Annie just got bingo. Thank you, as always, for coming and engaging in these conversations, which not only are we engaging in democracy, but I think we give each other hope that we can meet here every week in this way and talk about things that are history related, but very much have a lot of immediate bearing on the immediate present in an important way. So I thank you for that as well. And I will now let Grace sort of sign things off for NCHE, and then we will segue to the after party.
Sounds great. Thank you all again for being here on behalf of NCHE. We're very pleased that you could be here. Again, we will have this posted on Facebook and Twitter shortly. Make sure that's extra prompt today. We do, again, if you liked this, we do have lots of offerings at NCHE. We've got some incredible webinars. We've got professional learning. If you want to travel this summer, we've got all kinds of options for that. And we do, of course, have our conference March 17th through 20th with incredible speakers, incredible breakout sessions, incredible History Matters, and so do cocktails, although you don't have to come to the conference to come to that. But just, you can find all those things at ncheteach.org. So thank you all so much. And we are going to stop recording and start partying now.
I will answer too while we're doing this. Someone has asked, what is bingo? You guys. So for BC, who has asked, what is bingo? There is an ongoing bingo game every week based on the things that I predictably will say. And I guess, Annie, if someone who is in charge of bingo-ness can explain how to beam into that, then BC, you could play this in future if you would like to. Poof. I will let someone else explain that.
And in continuing the theme of I came in the back door to Zoom this morning, John has the control of the recording.
John!